Bonjour, everybody. Niigaan Webinam Indigenous Costs. Nice to see everybody. My name is Niigaan Sinclair. This is part 2 of our workshop, and let's get right into it. So this workshop is brought to you by Create to Learn. And it's a wonderful organization sponsored by Taking It Global. And what they're doing is they're doing great art, how to do workshops, and it's in partnership with Imaginative. And they're asking people who have done different work in the community to be able to share. And as a writer, I'm a writer, so I'm going to do part Niige, which is number 2, of how to write and share your story in creative nonfiction. And as you can remember from last time, we're asking everyone to use the hashtag Create to Learn while you're doing this workshop. Like I said, we're on part 2 today, Niige. And if you want to, shout out to me, or if you had something good to say, or if you had some feedback, or if you just want to reach me, this is my hashtag, my handle, on Twitter, and this is also my handle on Instagram. I also have a Facebook page, a writer page on Facebook. I also have a personal page on Facebook. Feel free to reach out and send a message to me. Would love to hear on your thoughts on either part 1 or what you enjoyed for today, or the other 2 parts which come after this. And so like I told you before, I'm a professor. I'm also a former teacher, high school teacher. But now what I am is I'm a professor mostly at the University of Manitoba, and I'm a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. And so you can look up my columns. In fact, we're going to look at one today as kind of a follow-up for ways we can think about being a writer. This workshop is in 4 parts. And so last time for Bishik, we did What is Your Story? And for this one, we're going to be doing Niige, which is creating your story. As I mentioned before, all you're going to need is a writing device or a pen and some paper, and you're also going to need your own life experience. I hope that you have some ideas, which we did from last time, and I also hope that you're able to move forward and do the next 2 workshops, which is Nisui, recreating your story or editing, and Niwin, publishing your story, which is the very final workshop. Now, just to remind you of what we did last time, we talked a little bit about what do stories do and what are the elements that are within every story. It really doesn't matter if it's called nonfiction, because as we know before, from what I spoke to you about before, the lines between fiction and nonfiction are quite blurry. There is writers will say, oh, I made up that world. And really, if you look into their work, you'll see a lot of the elements which come from their real life. And so while we may call it fiction, it's often nonfiction posing itself as fiction. And so, literary critics have a lot of fun looking at this kind of thing. And we also might think that nonfiction is very much fiction because it is a representation of yourself. And as writers, or as anybody for that matter, when we tell stories, we also tend to leave out certain elements or make ourselves look better than perhaps we really were in that moment. Or remember when you think back and you say, oh, on that day I would have went and saved that dog who was about to run onto the road, but maybe on that actual day you weren't even thinking about that dog, and when that dog was maybe hit by a car or something like that, you maybe didn't even notice that dog, or maybe you noticed it subconsciously. And so, as a writer, we're constantly remaking our lives all the time. And so the important thing to understand is that every fiction or nonfiction is a story. It has characters, location, conflict, usually somebody trying to get something, or somebody trying to understand something, or usually somebody trying to achieve a task in some way. And then there's stakes, and the stakes are the hardest thing to understand about any story, which is, why are we hearing it now? What is the most important elements of that? And then there's the conclusion. And the conclusion is always the elements, and sometimes they're really finite conclusions, sometimes they're to be continued, sometimes they're riding off, together into the sunset and falling in love, or whatever that conclusion might be. Sometimes it's, there will be more to come, whatever that might be. And so that conclusion, those conclusions are always parts of the story that are really important, and one of the 5 elements. So every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But within those frameworks are those 5 elements. Sometimes a story will begin with the conclusion. Sometimes a story will have the characters which aren't really refined until the end, or sometimes we won't know the location until the final conclusion. But every story has those 5 elements. And so we can move those around and we can shift those and think about what they look like. But every story will have a past, something that happened before, a present, which is what the story we're hearing about, and then often the future and what happens next. So you remember your assignment for last time, which is that you were to pick 5 events that created your life. And so you all have that work done now. And you can see you have a piece of paper right here, and you also have a pen, just like I do right here. You're always ready to go, and you're always ready to work, or if maybe it's a computer screen and whatever you might have. You've got your 5 events. And what I ask you to do is I ask you to take each event and then try to flesh it out a little bit. Take some facts and figures and details and use the little, because the little are really what represents the big. We might always think, when you walk down the street and you see a cigarette butt, you don't know who just came, why they left that cigarette butt maybe without stepping on it, or why is it only half smoked, or whatever that might be. And you walk up and you're like, I wonder about that. There's a story here. Or you might walk up to and you might see a car with its door open. You may think, oh, it's really small, but like, what led that car to be in the middle of the street with the door open, and what are the elements? And that's a really beautiful kind of little, most of my columns that I write for the Winnipeg Free Press always starts with the little. And it always starts with something very small, like somebody said something one day or did something one day, or there was one little moment that a politician said something, or whatever that might be. But there's that tiny little thing which represents the big, and that's really where you can begin stories. And so that's why we did that assignment last time. The little means the big. Now, once you've got that little, then your journey begins as a storyteller, because you can begin to flesh that out. And I really like this painting by Daphne Ojig. It's called The Indian in Transition. It's a mural that she created in 1978. And what she was really talking about is the journey of Indigenous people, the journey of where Indigenous peoples have come, where they are, and where they're going. And of course, in the 1970s, it was a very tumultuous time for many of our grandparents and our parents who were living in that period. I was only born around this time period. And so it was kind of this moment in which there was a lot of trepidation, a lot of concern. Many of us were, for example, first time in university. Many of us were marching. Many of us were just beginning to become lawyers and start with land claims. Big court decisions were happening at this point. This was even before the time when the Canadian government was forced to consult with us on land claims. So it was really just in a stillest time period where the federal government was just taking lands without any interest or concern for Indigenous peoples. And in many ways, that period is still continuing today. But it was a really tumultuous time, very conflictual time. And you can see that in the painting. You can see this very autobiographical painting about both Daphne's life, but it's also about Indigenous people as a whole, really about the small things like drums and songs and images of residential school, and also images of tradition, but then also the future itself of what does it look like for people to be able to enter into a universe. And and in that that last image in the part just over here, in the very far right part of the painting, you can see the dreams of the future, which were us, and if we were to make this painting today, or if somebody were to make this painting today, it would look very different. It would be in a very, very different time period, but it would still be a story which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, the past, the present, and the future, and have all those elements: characters, location, conflict, stakes, and then also a conclusion. And so this journey that you're about to go on will involve many different elements. And I want you to begin this journey by starting with the first line. Now, first lines of stories are really important because they are what set the tone. And you can look to see some first lines of stories on this chart that I've taken from a website, which is called First Line. And you can actually look up websites which will give you a first line. So if you really don't want to make up your own first line, you can just go to websites and get a first line and just try it and try to get your story to match that first line. As you can see for Cormac McCarthy, his first line is "See the child." That's the first line of that story. or they can be really detailed long lines which describe the scene, such as Sylvia Plath, or it could be in Zora Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. It's about something that people are seeing. And then you could also be a really wordy one, and maybe that could set up the, what I'm going to tell you later is short sentences are way better than long sentences on any nonfiction piece, any story for that matter. But you might want to, you know, read over these first lines and try to make it provocative and simple, short, and also gesture to some of the 5 things that you might think about. Maybe there's characters in them, maybe there's a location, maybe you might gesture to the conflict, like they both looked at the last chocolate bar, and maybe that's whatever that first line is. Now I'm going to show you a piece that I wrote, and I'm going to stop the sharing here. So we're going to go back to the image here, and then I'm going to share the screen of after I pull this up a little bit. There we go, right there. Okay, so this is a piece that I brought up last time, which is about my grandfather. And I just want to show you what this piece, the very first line of this piece is. The very first line that I wrote is, Grandpa Henry never spoke about the war. So you can see there's characters in there. There's also a gesture to a conflict. And there's even kind of a sense of stakes, because if he never spoke about it, then now if he does speak about it, it's a really big deal. And so that's why, you know, we've got 3 of the 5 elements already done in the very first line. So what I wanted you to do is I want you to try a first line of your story right now. And what you're going to do is pull up the, there we go, right there. I want you to try the first line of a story. Now I'm going to wait for you. I'm going to ask you to pause the video for 5 minutes, and I want you to try writing 5 first lines, 1 for each event that you have. Okay, so pause it right now. Try 5 first lines right now, and I'll wait. Okay, now welcome back. Welcome back for after you've got your first lines began. And one thing I'm going to tell you is that the problems with stories are that once you begin, the biggest thing you're going to have trouble with is trying to find an ending to it, or trying to find some kind of solution to the conflict. Because conflicts, characters, and locations are actually the easiest things to come up with. You can come up with them on your own. In fact, it's a really good game you can try to play with a friend who's a writer. You might want to say, hey, let's come up with a list of characters, a list of locations, and a list of conflicts. But it's the stakes and the solutions which are going to be some of the things that you're going to have to think about. And that's why here are some things that might help you. I really like this painting by Androgyny, called Androgyny by Norval Morrisseau, because it involves many different elements that talk about a number of different things. One is the politics of gender, and also the politics of space, treaties and land claims, which are all within this painting of, notice how it's not just human beings, it's also non-human beings which are sharing the land and interacting. There's also a notion of spirituality in this painting. There's a notion of truth. There's also a notice of dreaming and fiction. And so within this painting, there's all these different parts which suggest to you what really makes a conflict interesting, which is the politics and perspective and the issues that are at play. And so those issues that will come up in your pieces are things like gangs, or murdered missing Indigenous women and girls, or maybe over-incarceration rates of our young people, or maybe they might be about land claims, or they might be about trying to figure out how is it that we can fix this tainted water issue, or whatever it might be. It's those politics and issues that go within our pieces that are really important. Some of the most important pieces of Indigenous literature that have ever been written are really appearing to be stories about people, but they're really stories about the politics and the issues that those people are facing. We're going to talk a little bit in a moment about how you make people care, and you work on empathy in just a moment. So we're going to work on that in just a minute. But, you know, in these kinds of moments, you look for the little slices of life, the little moments in which you can show people that human beings aren't just those politics and issues, but there are perspectives, and there's sometimes humor and funniness, you know, and there's lots of different elements that make human beings complex, which is that there's no easy answers to these issues and these perspectives and these politics. There's you know, for every Indigenous person who is an activist, there's an Indigenous person who supports pipelines. And there is a number of conflicts that come in between that are worth investigating, that are worth thinking about. There are many Indigenous peoples who are unemployed, and there are many Indigenous peoples who are employed. And there's also many Indigenous peoples who know their language and many people who don't speak their language. And that kind of complexity and interestingness needs to come out in your story, because that can also create a lot of humor and interest and reality based within our stories. The bottom line is that when you begin to write your stories, try to really resist convention, which are those stories which happen over and over and over again. They're really predictable. We're going to talk about cliches in the future as we begin to edit. Give us the unexpected. Give us those things which you can, really find out, when your auntie said this one thing to you at one point and you went, wow, like I didn't think you were like that auntie, or I didn't think that you thought like that auntie, or your grandparent tells you a joke that's totally inappropriate and you're like, wow, like I didn't know. I didn't expect that at all from my grandmother, or maybe you did, and maybe they told an appropriate joke and you're like, oh, that's unpredictable as well. There are many different tips of writing that I'm going to share with you, but I'm just going to share with you a whole bunch of different things that you can think about as you're writing, because I'm going to assign you to write in just a moment on one of those 5 events that you began, and that use that first line that you started. Storytellers are only a contributor to your story. So your job is really to only give the reader as much as they need for them to construct the story, because you are giving people a piece, but don't give them all of it, because that's where the enjoyment of reading your writing really operates, which is that give people a conversation where not everything is explained. Maybe people can figure out that these 2 individuals who are speaking had a previous relationship or a conflict, or maybe they had a trip that they went on before, but we're not quite sure where that was, or we're not quite sure exactly what happened in that trip. We just know it was something bad. And so, don't give the reader everything. Give them parts to what I call the ingredients, but don't give them the dinner, because let them make the dinner. Know that every story is not completely exact. And that's why it might be important for you to think about the stories that you tell might involve different perspectives. And this is where what's most often called appropriation, but what sometimes writers call creativity, trying out different voices and trying out different pronouns and trying out different experiences, or thinking about how people might read it from other points of view, or how other characters might speak from other points of view. And that's why it's important when you write about nonfiction that you probably already encountered people who aren't like you, who don't think like you, who don't have the same sexuality and don't have the same race as you, or don't speak the same language as you. And that's why it's important to think, what would it be like for that person, and why did they say that thing in that moment? Why would they act in that particular way? And that way you can reflect and make them more realistic. And so there's some storytelling techniques that you can see on the right-hand side that you want to remember as you're beginning to construct your story and your dialogue. Now, here we are on your assignment yet again. We're at the assignment time. It's time for you to write. I want you to try a 300 to 500 word story using one of the first lines from your events. And so I want you to, what you did a few minutes ago is you came up with some first lines. Try that first line. I want you to keep a narrative arc, beginning, middle, and an end, a past, a present, and a future. Have the 5 elements within that story, within that 500 words or so. Focus on the issue and theme without stating it. Like, don't say this is a story about land claims, but talk about the idea of what would it be like for a community to experience the loss of that land, or maybe they're talking about love, but don't ever use the word love. Just without stating it, talk about the issue, and then have a conclusion and a concluding line. I really want you to work towards getting a concluding line. And here's a hint for you. If you ever get stuck working on a concluding line, look to be what your first line was, and then take some variation of that. Maybe even use the same line, or try to make the same line kind of work. Make it sound similar to the first line. People will think you're brilliant, because that is a typical convention of coming around and thinking about, most of our stories begin with our endings. And so those things will be able to come together. And what you'll find is that you'll start to write in a cyclical manner that much sounds like many of our traditional stories. Now, that's the end of part Niige, part 2. The next part, which is part Nisui, 3, is recreating your story, which we're going to talk about editing and how do you get a story from kind of a raw sculpture to now something really refined, something that is really deft and distinct, and you can get it to a point where maybe even you want to begin to think about publishing it. Again, I say a huge miigwech. I say a huge miigwech to the Create to Learn people and for the Taking It Global sponsorship that they give for this particular series to become available. This is my email. You can also reach me on Twitter and Instagram and on Facebook if you'd like. My handles are on the previous slides that you've seen, and I'll see you for the next piece. A huge miigwech to you.